A woman's voice thundered through a packed arena like a cannon blast indoors. $10,000. Every clean punch that connects. $10,000. I will pay it out of my own pocket. The woman making this declaration stood barefoot on a raised wooden platform, illuminated by harsh white overhead lights. She weighed 850 pounds. Her dark blue robes draped over her frame like curtains on a cathedral wall, cinched at the waist with a wide gold belt that could have wrapped around a grown man twice. Her name was Harumi Onaga, and she was the most formidable female fighter ever recorded in the Asian underground circuit. Over 12 years of cross-discipline competition, no one man or woman had ever managed to defeat her. 51 fights, 51 victories. She had thrown skilled judokas off platforms, pinned karate black belts beneath her overwhelming weight, and once won a match against a Muay Thai fighter simply by walking into him until his feet lost contact with the ground. She wasn't just undefeated, she was the reason most fighters in the circuit chose early retirement. Nobody wanted that phone call. Nobody wanted to be the next body she slammed through the mat. The crowd adored her. 4,000 people packed into metal bleachers, stomping their feet and screaming her name until the building trembled. She stood at the center of that platform with arms spread wide and a confident grin, like she had already claimed the night as her own. Then the other fighter walked out. He arrived alone, no team, no corner crew. He wore a clean white gi with a black belt tied at his waist. Barefoot, he stepped onto the platform as casually as one might step onto their own front porch. Relaxed, easy, no urgency. When the overhead lights caught his face, the front row noticed something that made the cheering falter. He was smiling, not a nervous or performative smile, but a calm, quiet, almost amused expression, as if he had already heard the wager, as if he had already counted the money. Bruce Lee weighed 141 pounds. The woman across from him weighed 850 pounds. She had just bet $10,000 for every clean strike he could land on her body, confident that the number would remain zero. The size disparity was beyond dramatic. It was almost absurd. She could have fit 3 of him within her shadow. A few spectators in the front rows stopped laughing and began exchanging uneasy glances. This no longer looked like a contest. It looked like something that could go dangerously wrong in a matter of seconds. Lee tilted his head slightly and looked up at her, way up. He studied her the way an architect examines a building he intends to dismantle. Not with fear, not with awe, but with genuine interest. Everyone in that arena believed the same thing. The smaller man was about to be crushed. The bet was secure. The money would never leave her pocket. In 20 seconds, she would owe more than she had earned in her entire career. But we're not there yet. To understand what happened on that platform, you need to go back 3 weeks, because this fight almost never happened. 3 weeks prior to that platform, Bruce Lee was the most talked about fighter no one could control. In the martial arts world of the late 1960s, Lee had become something between a revolution and a contagion. He had trained in Wing Chun under Yip Man in Hong Kong, and before he turned 21, he had already begun dismantling every system he'd learned, rebuilding them into something no one had a name for. Boxing footwork, fencing distance, judo leverage, wrestling control, he extracted techniques wherever he found truth and discarded anything that couldn't withstand a real exchange. He called the result Jeet Kune, the way of the intercepting fist. The philosophy behind it made the traditional martial arts establishment seethe with anger. He said it openly in rooms filled with grandmasters in front of cameras. Rigid styles produce rigid fighters, he declared. Tradition without adaptation is a cage. A belt around your waist means nothing if the man wearing it can't think beyond his own training. Absorb what is useful, reject what is useless. Add what is essentially your own. That philosophy simultaneously made him the most respected and most despised man in the fighting world. On the other side of this story was Harumi Onaga, who was not just a fighter, she was a business empire. She had begun training in sumo at 15, during an era when women in the sport were virtually invisible. By 20, she had transitioned to the underground cross-discipline circuit because no sanctioned women's division could contain what she was. By 28, she was 850 pounds of raw, trained, explosive force, with 51 consecutive victories that had built her a personal fortune. She commanded appearance fees. She sold out arenas. She set her own odds and collected percentages from every ticket sold at her events. She wasn't managed by anyone. She managed herself. Every dollar she had ever made, she earned by stepping onto a platform and making her opponent regret showing up. Onaga first heard Lee's name from a sparring partner who had traveled to Hong Kong. The partner told her about a 141-pound man who had knocked out a Japanese black belt in 11 seconds at a YMCA in Seattle. The partner said this man didn't fight within any known system, that he moved like nothing anyone had ever witnessed. Onaga listened. Then she laughed, not politely, but a deep, dismissive, belly-shaking laugh that made the walls of her training room vibrate. 141, she repeated. I carry more than that in one leg. But the story stuck. It lingered in the back of her mind like a splinter she couldn't extract. Over the following days, an idea began to form, not just a fight, but something bigger, something that would sell more tickets than anything she had ever done. A public bet so outrageous that every fight fan in Asia would hear about it before the first punch was thrown. She just didn't realize she was planning her own financial ruin. Onaga didn't use intermediaries, she never had. When she wanted a fight, she made the call herself. She sent word to Lee through a contact in Hong Kong, not a letter, not a formal invitation, but a verbal message passed mouth to mouth through the circuit until it reached a sweat-stained training hall in Kowloon, where Lee spent his mornings driving his fists into a wooden dummy until the wood cracked. The message was pure Onaga, no pleasantries, no negotiation. Exhibition match, my platform, open rules. If he's the fastest man alive, let him prove it against someone who doesn't move out of the way. $10,000 for every clean strike he lands on me, and I will stand right in front of him and let him try. The offer was designed to humiliate before the fight even began, a dare wrapped inside an insult. She wasn't just challenging Lee, she was telling him that she was so confident in her size, so certain that his speed meant nothing against 850 pounds of trained mass, that she would literally pay him for every punch that got through. The unspoken message was simple: you can't hurt me, you can't move me, and I'm willing to bet my own money to prove it. Lee's response came within hours, one word: when. When the people around Lee heard what he'd agreed to, the reaction was sharp. A training partner named Huang sat him down and didn't bother being polite. She's not like anyone you've fought. She crushed a 220-pound judoka in Taipei, sat on his chest, cracked 2 ribs without throwing a single punch. The man couldn't breathe. They pulled her off him after 40 seconds, and he still couldn't stand on his own. Huang leaned forward. If she gets her hands on you, Bruce, your speed is gone, you're underneath 850 pounds and the fight is over. Lee listened without interrupting. When Huang finished, Lee asked one question: how does she close distance? Huang paused. She walks forward, straight line, arms wide. She doesn't chase. She just comes at you like a wall. Lee nodded. Then he asked something Huang didn't expect. How big is the platform? That was all. No trash talk, no bold claims, no declaration about what he planned to do to the biggest woman in the circuit. Just 2 questions, and both were about space and movement. Not strength, not size, geometry. The fight spread through the underground like fire through dry grass. Bruce Lee, 141 pounds, versus Harumi Onaga, 850 pounds. Open rules: $10,000 per clean strike. The betting lines opened the same day. Onaga was a 20-to-1 favorite. Some bookmakers wouldn't even take action on Lee. One oddsmaker in Manila laughed out loud and said he'd sooner take bets on which direction the wind would blow. Lee said nothing more about the fight to anyone. He walked into his training hall, closed the door, and didn't come out for 3 weeks. What he built in that room is what separated a beating from a payday. The first thing Lee did behind that closed door was stop fighting. For 3 full days, he didn't throw a single strike. He sat cross-legged on the wooden floor of his Kowloon training hall, watching borrowed film reels of sumo tournaments and underground heavyweight bouts. He studied how bodies over 400 pounds moved, how they shifted weight before a charge, how their hips rotated a half beat before their arms reached, how their feet planted wide and their center of gravity rode low like a boulder rolling downhill once they committed to forward motion. He rewound the same clips dozens of times. He wasn't watching the wins, he was watching the moments between the moves, the tiny windows when all that mass was in transit and the feet hadn't yet caught up with the intention. Most people would never see those windows. Lee watched them until he could feel their rhythm in his own pulse. On the 4th day, he started building. He had 2 training partners strap weighted vests to their bodies, 60 pounds each. He instructed them to charge at him from across the hall, full speed, arms wide, mimicking the straight-line approach Huang had described. 50, 60 times a day. At first, Lee didn't strike back. He only moved, sidestepped, pivoted, measured the exact distance he needed, not an inch more, to let a heavy body pass without contact. He was mapping the geometry of evasion the way a pilot maps a runway before landing. His training partner, Lau, watched from the corner of the hall every day for 2 weeks. Years later, in an interview with a Hong Kong martial arts journal, Lau described what he saw. He wasn't training to fight her. He was training to not be where she was. 2 guys would run at him and he'd just vanish. Not far, just enough. Like the space around him bent and let him through. I have never seen a human body do what his body did in that room. By the second week, Lee added a fence. He filled a heavy bag with wet sand until it weighed close to 300 pounds and hung it from a reinforced ceiling beam. He struck it every morning until his knuckles split open, healed overnight, and split again. But he wasn't training for power the way most fighters understand power. He was training for penetration. A powerful strike hits a surface and stops. A penetrating strike passes through. Lee needed his blows to travel past the thick armor of muscle and mass that protected Onaga's frame and reach what lived underneath. Bone, nerve, the structures that didn't care how much you weighed. He drilled one combination more than any other, a low sweep to the ankle followed by a rising open palm strike to the chest. Hundreds of repetitions, slow, then fast, then slow again, until the 2 motions fused into a single continuous movement, like one word spoken without a breath between the syllables. On the morning of the 21st day, Lee folded a clean white gi and placed it into a canvas bag beside a worn black belt. He walked out of the training hall and did not look back. The preparation was over. Now he had to find out if 21 days of invisible work could survive 20 seconds of 850 pounds coming straight at him. Lee arrived at the venue 6 hours before the doors opened. The arena was a converted warehouse on the industrial edge of Nagoya, concrete walls stained with years of moisture, steel rafters running overhead like the ribs of a ship, wooden bleachers bolted into welded metal frames on 3 sides. And in the center of the floor, raised 2 feet off the ground and lit by 4 overhead lamps, sat the platform, 12 feet by 12 feet, hardwood, scuffed, and dented from years of bodies hitting it at speed. This was where Onaga had finished her last 11 fights. This was the stage she had built her fortune on. Lee walked through the empty building alone. His footsteps bounced off the concrete and came back to him like echoes in a cave. He set his canvas bag against a far wall and stepped onto the platform barefoot. He stood in the center and looked around, not admiring but measuring. He walked to each edge. He counted his steps from one side to the other. He crouched and pressed his palm flat against the wood, testing the grain, the friction, the way his skin gripped the surface. He dragged his barefoot across the boards and noted the resistance. Then he returned to the center, closed his eyes, and went completely still. A maintenance worker, sweeping the far bleachers, later told a local journalist what he witnessed that morning. The small man in bare feet stood motionless at the center of that platform for nearly 15 minutes. Eyes closed, not stretching, not shadow boxing, not warming up, just standing and breathing, like he was listening to something buried inside the wood beneath his feet. 4 hours later, the weigh-in turned the whole thing into a spectacle. Onaga stepped onto the industrial scale first. She moved slowly, her dark blue robes shifting around her massive frame, the gold belt catching the light. The needle swung hard to the right and settled, 850 pounds. She stepped off without looking at the number. She already knew it. She'd been this weight for 3 years. It wasn't a statistic to her, it was a weapon. Lee stepped on next. The needle barely moved, 141 pounds. A woman from the local press snorted a laugh and quickly pressed her hand over her mouth. One of the officials looked at both numbers on his clipboard, blinked twice, and passed the card to the judge's table without a word. The difference was 709 pounds. Written side by side on paper, it looked like someone had made a clerical error. Onaga stood behind the officials, watching every reaction in the room. She saw the laughter. She saw the disbelief. She saw exactly what she wanted to see, a room full of people who already believed her money was safe. She cracked her knuckles one hand at a time, slow and deliberate, and the sound popped through the quiet room like small firecrackers. By 7 that evening, every seat in the building was taken. The overhead lamps hummed, the bleachers groaned under the shifting weight of 4,000 bodies. The platform sat empty under the lights, waiting. The back corridors opened, and the night began. The building felt her before anyone saw her. A low vibration moved through the concrete floor, up through the metal frames of the bleachers, and into the legs of 4,000 people. Footsteps slow, heavy, each one carrying a weight that the architecture of the building wasn't designed to ignore. The back corridor darkened as Onaga filled it. She walked flanked by 3 handlers in matching black jackets, but nobody looked at them. Nobody could look at anything else. She emerged into the arena light, and the crowd detonated, stomping, screaming, chanting her name so loud the overhead lamps swayed on their chains. 850 pounds of dark blue robes and gold belt, moving toward the platform like a tide that nothing could redirect. She climbed the 3 wooden steps, and each one groaned under her. She reached the center, planted her feet, and raised both arms. The crowd doubled in volume. This was their champion, their certainty, their mountain. In the far corridor opened, and Bruce Lee walked out alone, silent, white gi loose on a frame that looked almost fragile under the arena lights, black belt at his waist, bare feet on the concrete. He moved through the noise the way a stone moves through water, untouched by it. He climbed the platform steps without pausing and stood at his mark. The cheering thinned out the way a fire thins when the oxygen drops. People didn't know what to do with the visual. On one side of the platform, a woman wider than the door frame she'd walked through. On the other, a man who looked like he could stand in her pocket. This was the thumbnail, the image that everyone in that building would remember. 2 fighters facing each other across 12 feet of scarred hardwood, and the difference between them so extreme that it didn't look real. Onaga stared down at Lee. She had to angle her chin almost to her chest to meet his eyes. The height difference, the width difference, the sheer absurdity of the visual gap, a smile spread across her face. Not warm, not respectful, the smile of someone looking at something small and deciding it wasn't worth worrying about. She spoke loud enough for the first 10 rows to hear, loud enough for the words to travel through the crowd in whispers within seconds. $10,000, little man. Every clean punch, every clean kick, I will pay you myself, out of my own pocket. She paused, let the crowd react. Then she leaned forward just slightly and added one more line. You'll leave here with exactly what you came with, nothing. Lee looked up at her, that same calm, easy, half-amused smile he'd carried since he stepped onto the platform. He didn't respond. He didn't flinch. He didn't shift his weight. He just stood there, hands relaxed at his sides, and let her words hang in the air like smoke from a fire that hadn't started yet. The referee stepped to the center. He looked at both fighters. He raised his right hand. The arena went quiet for 0 people holding one breath. His hand came down. What 850 pounds looks like coming at you full speed is not something the human brain is built to process calmly. Onaga launched off her back foot and came straight at Lee. Both arms wide, fingers spread. The platform didn't just shake, it sang. The wood groaned under the force of each step like a ship taking on water. Every person in the first 6 rows jerked backward at the same time, a reflex born from something ancient in the spine that says, move when something that big is moving. 3 seconds in, Lee stepped left, one motion, smooth and tight, like a door swinging open on a perfect hinge. Onaga's mass carried her forward and past him. Her right side opened for a half second, and Lee's fist was already there. 2 compact strikes to the ribs, straight punches thrown from the hip with his entire 141 pounds threaded into each one. The sound was sharp and heavy at the same time, like a butcher's block taking a hit. 2 clean strikes, $20,000. 3 seconds gone. Onaga's momentum took her to the edge of the platform. She caught herself with one foot on the border, turned and reset. Her face showed nothing, no pain, no acknowledgement. She came again, tighter this time, arms closer to her body. She'd already adjusted. This woman was not just enormous, she was experienced. 7 seconds in, Lee didn't sidestep this time. He dropped his weight low, shifted backward half a step, and drove a single kick into Onaga's front knee. Not the thigh, the knee, the one joint in the human body that doesn't care if you weigh 141 pounds or 850. It answers to physics and physics alone. Her leg buckled, her stride collapsed. Her upper body lurched forward while her foundation crumbled for a quarter second beneath her. She caught herself. She didn't go down, but the platform boomed when her foot slammed flat to recover balance, and 4,000 people heard it in their chests. 3 strikes, $30,000, 7 seconds. The crowd had shifted. The roaring had thinned into murmuring, pockets of conversation breaking out across the bleachers. People pointing, people leaning forward, people turning to the person next to them and asking if what they just saw actually happened. Onaga's eyes had changed. The amusement was gone. The showmanship was gone. What was left was something older and more dangerous. She stopped charging. She planted her feet, widened her stance, and waited. When Lee circled right, she didn't follow with her feet. She followed with her arm. One massive hand shot out sideways, fast for something that big, and closed around Lee's left wrist like a vice made of flesh and bone. 850 pounds of grip pressure locked down on a wrist that weighed less than a house cat. 11 seconds in, $30,000 gone. And now the most dangerous woman in the circuit had hold of the fastest man alive. This was the moment everyone had warned Lee about, the exact scenario his training partners had described with fear in their voices. Once she has you, it's over. Onaga's grip tightened until her knuckles turned pale against the dark fabric of her robes. She yanked Lee forward hard. His feet slid on the wood. She was pulling him into her body, trying to close the gap, trying to get her other arm around his torso and collapse the fight into a grappling match where 850 pounds was the only rule that mattered. Lee didn't pull away. Every nerve in the human body screams, pull back. When something that massive has hold of you, Lee did the opposite. He stepped toward her into the grip. His right hand came up fast, and the heel of his palm struck the soft underside of her wrist, directly where the tendons meet the joint. Not a power shot, a precision shot, a strike aimed at a point that no amount of body mass can protect. Onaga's fingers opened involuntarily, like a circuit had been cut. Lee's wrist slid free, and he was 4 feet away before her hand had finished closing on nothing. 12 seconds. 4 clean strikes, $40,000. The referee rushed between them, both hands raised. An official at the judges' table had called for a medical check. Onaga's knee was swelling where the kick had landed earlier. The referee directed her to her corner. A stool was brought. An ice pack pressed against the joint. One of her handlers knelt beside her and spoke low and fast. Onaga stared at the platform floor and didn't answer. Across the platform, Lee stood at his mark, hands at his sides, breathing the same as it had been before the fight started. Clean white gi without a wrinkle out of place. Not a mark on him. He looked like a man waiting for a bus. The crowd began to settle, tension leaking out of the building, conversations picking back up. A vendor near the entrance started calling out drink prices. It felt like the fight might be stopped, like the knee was enough, like maybe everyone could exhale and go home with a story about the small man who survived a few seconds against the mountain. Then Onaga stood up, not when anyone told her to, not after the officials cleared her. She shoved her handler sideways with one arm. The stool tipped and clattered off the platform edge. The ice pack hit the wood and slid. She straightened to her full height, and for the first time all night, her face showed something beyond amusement or confidence. It showed rage, pure, unfiltered, the kind that comes from a place deeper than pride. She fixed her eyes on Lee and walked forward. No whistle, no signal, just 850 pounds of fury crossing a wooden platform with nothing between her and a man who weighed a sixth of what she did. One of her handlers screamed from the platform edge, "Harumi, stop." She didn't stop, and from this moment on, this was no longer an exhibition. The moment Onaga crossed that platform without a whistle, everything that made this an exhibition evaporated like water on a hot skillet. Something changed in Lee, visible, immediate, the kind of shift that even people who had never watched a fight in their lives could feel in the pit of their stomachs. His stance dropped 2 inches. His feet widened. His hands came up tight and close to his center line, not the low, relaxed guard he'd been using. This was a different architecture entirely, compact, loaded, the posture of a man who was no longer performing and had started surviving. People in the front rows went still. They didn't have the words for what they were looking at, but something in the air had changed temperature. 14 seconds. Onaga threw a wild right hand, a looping swing with every pound of her body rotating behind it. If it had connected with Lee's head, the fight would have ended in a way that nobody in the building wanted to think about. Lee ducked it clean. Her arm sailed over his head close enough to brush the top of his hair, and before the arm could come back, Lee fired. 3 strikes, fast, so fast that the people in the front rows couldn't agree later on what they'd seen. Some said 2 punches, some said 3. One man in the second row told a reporter he only heard the sound, a rapid crack, crack, like someone snapping dry branches, because his eyes couldn't keep up with the movement. The final strike landed flush on the bridge of Onaga's nose. The sound was different from the body shots, sharper, wetter, the kind of sound that tells you something structural just broke. 17 seconds. 7 strikes total, $70,000. Onaga's head snapped backward. Her hands flew to her face. Blood came through her fingers immediately, bright red against the dark blue of her robes, bright red dripping onto the pale hardwood platform. The first real blood of the night. 4,000 people gasped. Not cheered, gasped. One collective inhale from every corner of the building at the same time. The referee rushed forward. He tried to step between them. Onaga shoved him aside with her forearm without turning her head. She pulled her hands away from her face. Blood ran freely from her shattered nose, down over her lips, down her chin, onto the gold belt at her waist. She stared at Lee through eyes that were already swelling shut, and she stepped forward again, not charging this time, walking heavy, deliberate, each step costing her something she wouldn't get back. The officials were on their feet. One of them was shouting. Nobody listened. The fight had left the borders of anything controlled. It was happening now, whether anyone sanctioned it or not. 18 seconds, $70,000 gone, her nose broken, her knee swelling, blood on the wood, and she was still coming. For the first time in the entire fight, Lee's face changed, a shift barely visible, a softening around the eyes, a loosening in the jaw. The people close enough to see it would carry the memory for years. It wasn't pity. It wasn't amusement. It was recognition. He was looking at a woman who was bleeding from a broken nose, swelling at the knee, struggling to breathe through a face full of blood, and still walking toward him, still refusing to stop. Something in Lee's expression said he understood what that kind of will cost a person, and he respected it. 19 seconds. Onaga closed the distance. 10 feet, 8-5. Each step was a choice. Each step was purchased with pain she would never admit to. Blood had dried in streaks down her chin and across the front of her dark blue robes. Her breathing sounded like a machine running on its last fuel, but her eyes were locked on Lee. Her fists were at her sides, and she was coming. Lee didn't move. For the entire fight he had been motion itself, sidestepping, pivoting, vanishing, reappearing somewhere else before the crowd could track him. Now he stood at the center of the platform and planted his feet, hands low, weight balanced, completely still, like he'd already decided exactly what was going to happen and was simply waiting for the moment to arrive. 3 feet. Onaga dropped her weight and lunged, both arms reaching for Lee's body. Every remaining ounce of 850 pounds committed to one final grab. If those arms closed around him, the fight would end on the ground where mass was the only language spoken. Those arms never closed. Lee dropped low. His left leg swept forward in a fast, precise arc that caught Onaga's lead ankle at the exact instant her weight was shifting forward. The timing was surgical. A fraction earlier, and her foot would have been planted. A fraction later, and the momentum would have carried her past. Lee hit the window perfectly, the same window he had watched 100 times on film reels, the same window he had drilled 1,000 times in a sweat-soaked training hall in Kowloon. Onaga's front foot vanished from under her. Her balance shattered. 850 pounds tipped forward with nothing to catch them. And before gravity could finish the job, Lee rose. His right palm drove upward into the center of her chest. Open hand, full extension. Not a strike that hit a surface, a strike that passed through it. The force reversed her direction entirely. Chest, shoulders, center of gravity, everything snapped backward at once. She went down flat on her back. The platform absorbed nothing, it transmitted everything. The sound was deep and enormous, like thunder born from wood instead of sky. People in the bleachers felt it rise through the metal frames and settle in their teeth. 20 seconds. Onaga lay on her back, eyes open, staring at the steel rafters, chest heaving, fully conscious, but her body had received a message that no amount of will could override. The fight was over. 850 pounds, flat on the ground, put there by 141 in exactly 20 seconds. 4,000 people, not a sound. The silence didn't just fill the arena, it pressed down on it. 4,000 people sitting in metal bleachers, and not one of them could find a sound to make. The overhead lamps hummed. Onaga's breathing scraped through the quiet, wet and ragged. And Lee stood at the center of the platform, 3 feet from the woman he had just put on the ground, as still as he had been in the seconds before the fight ended. Then he did something that no one in that building was prepared for. He bowed, deep, slow, traditional, his back straight, his head lowered, his arms at his sides. The kind of bow that a fighter gives before a match to honor the opponent across from them. The kind of gesture that says, "I see your courage, and I do not take it lightly." He gave it to a woman lying on her back in her own blood, on a platform she had owned for 12 years. And there was nothing in his face, nothing in his posture, nothing in the angle of his body that looked like mockery. It was the most sincere gesture anyone in that arena had witnessed all night. Onaga saw it from the floor, looking up past the lights. She watched Bruce Lee bow to her. Something collapsed behind her face. Not the pain. She had been managing pain since the first kick. Something underneath all of that. Something she had never been asked to carry before. Her eyes filled, her jaw locked tight, her chest shook once, and it had nothing to do with the palm strike. It had to do with a man half her size, a man she had laughed at, insulted, offered money to as a joke, choosing to lower his head to her after proving he could have ended the fight whenever he wanted. Nobody had ever trained her for that. Lee straightened from the bow, walked to where she lay, and extended his hand. Open palm, no fist, no victory pose, just a hand reaching down. Onaga looked at it for a long moment. Then she reached up and took it. Lee braced himself, feet wide, legs bent, and pulled. 141 pounds trying to lift 850 is not a gesture, it is real work. But Onaga pushed with her good leg, and together they got her to her feet. They stood face to face, her looking down, him looking up, hand in hand. Close enough that Lee had to tilt his head all the way back to meet her eyes. He said something quiet, only for her. The front row saw his lips move, but heard nothing. One of Onaga's handlers later told a journalist what she repeated backstage, sitting alone in a concrete dressing room after the building had emptied. Lee had said 5 words, "Your courage was the victory." A single clap broke the silence somewhere in the middle bleachers, then another, then a scattering from different sections, then the entire building, 4,000 people on their feet, not the wild screaming they had given Onaga during her entrance. Something different, slower, heavier, the kind of applause that comes from people who have just watched something they know they will carry for the rest of their lives. The total number of clean strikes Lee had landed in 20 seconds was later confirmed by 3 separate officials at the judges' table. The count was 9. 9 strikes at $10,000 each, $90,000. Onaga's entire career savings, gone in less time than it takes to tie a pair of shoes. She went bankrupt before she left the building. In the weeks that followed, the story of what happened on that platform in Nagoya traveled faster than any fight result in the history of the underground circuit. But the part that traveled furthest wasn't the sweep. It wasn't the palm strike. It wasn't the sound of 850 hitting hardwood so hard that people in the bleachers felt it in their bones. The part that kept moving from Tokyo to Hong Kong to Manila to Bangkok, passed along in low voices at training halls and late-night dinners, was what happened after Harumi Onaga reached out to Bruce Lee's camp 3 weeks after the fight. Not for a rematch, not to dispute the result, not to rebuild the reputation that had been shattered along with her bank account. She sent word through the same contact that had originally connected them. And the message she sent was the last thing anyone who knew her expected. She wanted to learn. 51 consecutive victories, 12 years of dominance, a fortune earned and lost on the same platform, and the woman who had laughed at the idea of a 141-pound man being a threat was now asking that same man to teach her what he knew. The underground circuit didn't know how to process it. A champion brought to the floor, financially ruined, publicly humbled, and her response was not anger, not denial, not retirement, it was curiosity. That story carried further and lasted longer than any fight highlight ever could. Lee never spoke publicly about the fight. That was his way. He let his work do the explaining and kept his words for the people in the room. But months later, a student filming a private training session in Kowloon captured something on shaky, poorly lit footage that revealed the truth underneath the spectacle. In the film, Lee practices a specific sequence, a low sweep to the ankle followed by a rising palm strike to the chest, over and over. Slow, then fast, then slow again. The exact combination that put Onaga on the floor, every angle precise, every shift of weight deliberate, every movement drilled so many times that it had stopped being a technique and had become part of his body's own language. What 4,000 people saw on that platform and called instinct was preparation. What looked like a moment of brilliance was months of invisible work compressed into 2 seconds of execution. That was the truth about Bruce Lee that most people missed. They saw the speed, they saw the spectacle, they talked about the talent, but underneath all of it was something far simpler and far harder. He worked when no one was watching. He prepared until losing wasn't a possibility he had left room for. He walked onto that platform knowing the dimensions of the wood, the friction of the surface, and exactly how many steps separated him from every edge. He didn't win because he was gifted. He won because he was ready. Onaga, in the only interview she ever gave about the fight, was asked what she learned from that night. She thought for a long time before answering. When she finally spoke, she said one sentence: "I bet on what I was. He bet on what he had become." Those are not the same thing. And the bow, that's what stayed with people longest. Not the technique, not the money, not the sound of a giant hitting the ground. The bow, the moment when a man who had been laughed at, insulted, underestimated, and dismissed chose to lower his head to the person who had done all of those things to him. The gesture she never gave him, he gave her freely. After winning, after proving everything, he didn't use the bow to humiliate. He used it to honor. And in doing so, he turned 20 seconds of violence into something that 4,000 people carried home and never forgot. Bruce Lee once wrote something in his private training notes that no one saw until years after his death. Any fool can knock someone down. The real measure of a fighter is whether he can lift them back up. A fist can put someone on the ground. Respect is what brings them to their feet.